1980s, it was discovered that DNA could be transferred from one organism to another. This marked the beginning of the genetic modification process. Genetically modified crops are a large part of diets today, and there are a lot of consequences that are not being shared. Worse than that, companies don't have to label food that is genetically modified. There are health concerns, environmental risks, and economic consequences that are attributed with GMOs today. We would like to get that word out. First, I'll give you a little history into GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. In 1983, a tobacco plant was created that was resistant to antibiotics, an early success for scientists creating GMOs. In 1990, it became genetically engineered cotton. In 1994, GMOs took an even bigger step. The Flavor Saver tomato hit grocery store shelves. This move was even approved by the Food and Drug Administration. The tomato was created with the expectation of a longer shelf life. In 1996, weeds were discovered that were resistant to herbicides as a result of the GM crops. These are called superweeds, and eventually required larger amounts of herbicides. In a big move around the world, Europe decided to mandate labeling GM crops in 1997. This even included animal feed. Other nations followed this precedent set by Europe, including Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. In 1998, Monsanto, which is the leading biotech company, created Roundup Ready, which is a soybean that is immune to herbicides. This led to an expansion of growing GM crops. This expansion of farming caused countries to plant more and more GM crops, especially the United States, and by 2004, the U.S. accounted for 59% of all GM crops, by far the leader in growing these GMOs. To have this opportunity to increase supply and use technology to aid in agricultural demands, this is why we need to be aware of the concerns of all these GMOs, and now we will be able to introduce some of the health concerns with these dangerous crops. While the harvest for most of these crops is used to feed cows, pigs, and chickens, some genetically engineered corn and soybeans have made their way into human food chains and are used to make tortillas, corn syrup, and corn oil for cooking. Today, about 75% of processed foods contain genetically engineered ingredients. As a result, thousands of products containing foreign or altered genes have been eaten by millions of people. But since these products aren't labeled or tested by impartial scientists, there is no way to trace back potentially adverse health consequences. A handful of scientists even speculate that genetically modified crops and the pesticides used to cultivate them may be partly responsible for the increased incidence of asthma, allergies, ADHD, and gastrointestinal disorders. Few animal studies have raised red flags, including some showing intestinal damage, structural changes in the kidneys, pancreas, and spleen, infertility, low birth weights, and cancerous tumors in rats. But proving a causal connection, especially in humans, is tricky. These studies raise questions that demand answers, but the government has chosen thus far not to do that. In fact, the FDA has ruled that because DNA is in every living organism, crops engineered with added genes are substantially the same, and other foods are no different from crops genetically modified through conventional breeding techniques. But that point of view rings hollow to scientist activists. There is no credible evidence that GMO foods are safe to eat, and no significant safety testing is required by the FDA. Many environmental concerns need to be risen as well. GM foods are engineered to be herbicide resistant, and that's a beneficial tool. Farmers can kill off weeds while not killing the crops. However, weeds are being contaminated by these crops and becoming herbicide resistant. The concern is that these weeds will become superweeds. Some states are considering a requirement to label genetically modified foods. Supporters say the labels would allow consumers to make better informed choices. Opponents say labels would unnecessarily create confusion and increase costs. We have the right to know what's in our food. Over 70% of processed foods have genetically modified ingredients. GM crops are modified to contain novel, patented bacterial and viral DNA, never before seen in foods. Not surprisingly, most polls show around 90% of the public want to know which foods are genetically modified. They want the same right to choose as consumers in the 64 countries around the world that mandate some form of labeling of those GM foods. Chemical and food corporations have raised millions to defeat labeling initiatives. They are willing to spend whatever it takes. Why are agrochemical companies willing to spend such huge sums to defeat labeling? To us, it seems simple. An informed consumer wouldn't choose those GM foods.